Hello and welcome to Downtime Activities and welcome to the Bonus Action Podcast Videocast, where Will and I have the conversations about nerdy RPG storytelling, a lot of times D&D related stuff that we were having anyways, but this time on camera. And today we're going to be going over something that every D&D character loves more than just about anything else.
Near and dear to all of our hearts.
The loot. What is good loot? What's the best kind of loot to give? And when do you give the best loot to players? To begin with, what is loot?
It's the treasures, it's the prizes, it's either the stuff they pick up along the way of doing a quest or clearing a dungeon, or it's the whole reason for doing a quest or doing a dungeon. It's piles of money, it's magic items, it's one-time use items, or even sometimes sort of strange things like animal companions, or a guild hall, or a home or a fortress of some kind, or a ship.
Even mundane items.
Absolutely.
That are just interesting or have tie into something that makes characters.
It's either something the players find valuable or has value in the world, or something the players find useful, ultimately.
So, before we talk about when you give the best loot, I think we should talk about what is the best loot. What is the stuff, when you are a player, what loot do you get that makes you the most excited?
It kind of goes a couple different ways here. It's either, the best loot is either the thing you happened to be looking for right then and there. Whether it's, you need a lot of money in order to complete another side quest, or you need a particular mundane item or semi-mundane item for a project the players are working on, or something you're trying to do, or for another quest. Or it's something that feels faintly tailored to your character, I think. Quite often the most satisfying loot to get is something that either fits your build or just fits sort of the style of your character in an interesting way. Or it's something that is so oddball or so interesting or so unique that you quite immediately become attached to it.
And this can, I think, we're going to talk a lot about interesting, unique, cool ways to do loot here. When you talk about like when it feels tailored to your character, or it's something just very useful to what your character is doing, a good example of this I can think of fairly recently in the Epic 6 game you're running. We had these kind of prizes at the end of a big tourney. My character, who's this kind of frontline sword and board fighter, got a +1 shield. And +1 shield, very basic magic item. It's just a shield that's a little better than your average shield. A little more armor class. But my character's very much been I'm interposing myself between my party and the bad guys. I'm taking the most hits. I want to be high AC. I'm a fighter. And I was super pumped, even though it was a very basic magic item, because it felt so tied into my character. Do you think, this is kind of an interesting conversation to have, by extension of that logic, is it better to make sure that the magic items you're putting into the loot pile, that you intentionally are tailor-making them to fit different characters, or should it be more random than that, do you think?
Both. I quite often when if I'm sitting down and creating a list of magic items, especially a list of faintly unique magic items, stuff that's not just pulled straight out of the Dungeon Master's Guide or out of an equipment list in a Savage Worlds game or something, I kind of try and go both ways. I want to make loot that's useful to certain characters, or that kind of fits the style or the build that certain characters are going for. For example, in that Epic 6 campaign, you guys have not encountered, by far, all of the magic items that might be sort of customized to your build. There might be more magic items that I intend sort of specifically for you to use. Whether or not you find all of them, or whether or not you find any of them, is kind of up in the air. Some of them require meeting optional NPCs or sort of going down optional paths. But I want to make sure that there's loot out there that makes you feel like you're doing what you do better. And I get a lot of satisfaction out of that, and I know that players really enjoy that. But I also think it's wonderful to have loot and to have magic items that either isn't tailored to anyone in particular, it's just sort of faintly useful, or it's something that's really outside of the whole party's play style or the whole party's sort of equipment set, because the ways that those magic items or the ways that that loot gets used is ultimately going to be much more unique, much more interesting, and much more memorable than giving the fighter +1 armor, or giving the rogue, a cloak that gives them advantage on stealth checks. You know how that equipment's going to be used. It's not necessarily going to be... There will be cool moments, but it's not necessarily going to be anything terribly interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But when you throw in a random magic item or a strange magic item that doesn't sort of tailor fit anybody in particular, it's gonna, like, weird stuff's gonna happen and memorable stuff's gonna happen. And a good example of this, and it's a style of loot that we can talk about here in a little bit, is when you gave a bunch of bad magic items to the party.
Bad.
None of which were, like, tailored to anybody in particular. It's just kind of a random assortment. And they're all very specifically chaotic joke items. It's a staff of raised dead, which just causes corpses to levitate. It's bagpipes of invisibility, that as long as you're playing them, it makes you invisible. Like, items that are sort of faintly useless and are kind of weird, but aren't tailored to the party. That's wonderful loot to get a hold of, and the way ultimately that those are going to be used is going to be very interesting.
And it just definitely kind of brings about creativity, especially when they're oddball items that have like a very weird effect or use. I also think it's really prudent I think that the more big, important, like, this is going to be the sword I use the rest of the campaign kind of items are kind of big loot items. Like, there's a quest at the end of it. The fighter gets this unique blade from a fallen hero, and that's the sword they use from that point forward because they were already a sword and board fighter. I think that's very cool. I like in more of the kind of in-between loot, the littler, like, less big overarching ones, to include items that nobody uses but people can have proficiency in. And so the big example I can think of is, like, if there's a character who tends to be a dual wielding weapon expert, but is a fighter, giving them a shield, or giving a shield to the party that has some sort of more narrow but useful ability on it, either that when it's, like, worn it does something, or when it's wielded it gives them some sort of ability, so then there's a kind of cost benefit kind of sort of discussion in the character's mind of, like, I deal a lot of damage with my great axe, but this is a shield of resist fire, and we're going against the red dragon today. I gotta use the shield, which means I'm using that shield until I get close, and I'm throwing that thing on my back, and I'm gonna try and lay damage out. And it kind of gives these, to put in like a video game sense, these kind of like multiple gear sets people will switch out between based on what the situation is. A heavy armor fighter, but there's a set of medium armor that could be used for better stealth or for better whatever it is. Items that don't technically fit one person, but could be used by somebody in the group, albeit in a different way than their character typically does.
And typically when those items are going to get used, it's going to be very intentional. The player characters are going to put thought into it, and that's a resource that they have in the back pocket. So, well, now that we're doing this big heist, I'll take the lower AC, but I'm going to use this medium armor that gives advantage on stealth so that I can take sort of this route, or I can be here to help.
I'm a strength-based character. I've got a rogue with me. I've got a bard with me. They're both good at sneaking. If I don't swap into something that helps me, then I'm going to blow this whole thing wide open. So I have this alternate gear set I can go to.
And it's just fun to give players more tools to use and sort of expand that toolkit. When you have a party entirely of, melee fighters and casters, giving them the one magical short bow or the one, magical crossbow that has some other effects or has some other ability to it, they're not going to use it the vast majority of the time. It doesn't fit anybody's build, but they have it there in case they need it for whatever niche application it's sort of designed to do.
I would, kind of off of my original question before we talked about all this, I would shy away from random loot tables, typically.
Yes.
I think it's a fine way to just kind of fill stuff out if you're in a pinch, whatever. I think you should always be intentional with loot. I think that intentionality is important, but that intentionality does not have to be tailor-making every item.
Yes.
So that it's good for the build of your characters. If you know you have a caster, having a kind of random but cool wand that their caster would be able to use, that doesn't really... It's not a wand of some fire damage for your pyromancer. It's something that does ice damage. And it's different, and it's not really going to cohesively mesh with their abilities, but when they go up against that red dragon, you need something that deals damage to it. Oh, I've got that wand. That thing still can do some damage. I'll swap to that for this. Those kind of items that doesn't have to fit the build, but it should still be intentional. And unless you're just giving it as a item of value for them to sell, shy away from giving a really interesting piece of loot that nobody can functionally use well.
Right.
If you've got nobody with heavy armor proficiency, don't make this sweet set of plate armor that no one can use without absolutely hamstringing their character be a big quest item. Make a half plate instead, so that the ranger can use it.
Well, unless that piece of heavy armor ends up important for story reasons, there's really no good reason to kind of throw that stuff into the loot pile, and that's the type of stuff you tend to run into with random loot tables.
Yes,
they tend to be balanced for the ideal Dungeons and Dragons party, which is one member of each class, even though that would be like 12 characters and you'd never get anything done.
Every combat would be, oh god.
Because that's always what, D&D in particular feels like it wants you to do, right? Is have your heavy armor frontliner,
have your healer,
have your support mage, have your DPS mage, have your rogue or ranger, or one of each, and you've got every armor slot filled, you've got every loot type filled, and that's how you set out to adventure. And that can be a lot of fun, and those parties will likely go far, as long as your DM's not being a dick. But you don't have to build that way, and if you feel like you have to build that way, you're kind of playing D&D wrong. You're kind of playing tabletop RPGs wrong. Yeah. You should really make the characters you want to make. There's nothing wrong with kind of filling roles in a party, but don't feel like you have to fill a role in a party.
If nobody's playing a cleric, don't bully the new player into playing a cleric, so that you have somebody with a bunch of healing spells. There are magic items, there are potions, there are ways to get healing outside of a healing class, and there are a vast quantity of classes that have access to some type of healing. You don't have to have that perfect party comp.
But loot tables feel like they're designed for that perfect party comp quite often. And there are some really good loot tables out there. And there are tons of, on just a broader note, really wonderful, just random tables in general that you can really just get a lot of use out of. But when it comes to loot, especially loot that's going to be memorable and actually either impact the story in some way or like leave an impression on the characters and really get used by the characters, random loot tables aren't as good as you said, being intentional with what you throw in there.
And then what I was just looking up here was like the Staff of Heal, for instance. Bards, clerics, or druids could use it. Throw that into a loot pile if you've got a bard in the party that's like a sword bard and tends to do lots of damage and use their stuff for that kind of combat. Now that bard is essentially your cleric in terms of like giving them something. If you notice the party is shy on healing.
And it's funny because they'll probably use it under protest.
Yeah.
They're like, fine, I'll
cure your leprosy.
It's whereas giving that to your healing cleric is going to be like, woohoo! Like,
this
is
I don't
exactly
have to use my
what
spell
I wanted.
slots for this anymore.
Whereas, like, you can give it to a character who can still get use out of it, but they're going to be, like, not necessarily annoyed that they got it, but the character might be kind of just, like, I'm not a healing cleric, I'm a bard. Stop making me put my loot down and run around and hit people with the Healy stick. And they will probably just actually hit people with the Healy stick.
But you totally can. Still a staff. Another good thing here with intentionality and magic items or loot is giving loot at the timing with intentionality that the players will have access to things they may need or may be very helpful in particular combats or encounters without it being right before the dragon boss fight room. There's just a chest next to the door that has 5 dragon slaying arrows in it.
Or it's full of cloaks of fire resistance.
Exactly. Stuff like that where it's like very hand wavy and obvious. Instead, 2 sessions before, one of the people you fight and kill happens to have a cloak of fire resistance. 2 sessions down the line, they hear tale of a red drake of the north that's conquered this dwarven hold. Now they've got this item to help have somebody who might need to shore up that defense be ready to fight that dragon. You can totally dot those things in. Intentionality is always key, though. You want to be intentional with when and how, and that it doesn't. It makes sense. Also, with like this is another good kind of thing to talk about is it makes sense with the kind of loot you're getting off of what you're fighting or where you're going to get.
Yes, absolutely.
It doesn't make sense to have, unless you're fighting a very weird, like bandit, to kill a bandit on the road and they have like 5 legendary magic items on them. If they had 5 legendary magic items, they wouldn't be a bandit. They would be selling one of those and using the other 4 to defend the fortress they bought up in the mountains and living the rest of their life there. Because bandits are usually bandits out of a necessity. So the kind of loot and the things that are there should make sense. Dragon hordes should have lots of things that kind of dragon would really be drawn to, be it gemstones, or some dragons are like all about art and stuff like that. Read the blurbs in the monster manual. Helps a lot.
Unless you're a player, in which case never read any of the blurbs in the monster manual.
Never do it. It's much more fun to have it naturally slap you in the face. But intentionality is key with loot across the board. What it is, when you give it, where you give it. And this brings me about another kind of conversation, which is, what about power level? When do you give powerful loot? If you give powerful loot too early, is that going to ruin your campaign? How do you feel about that?
We, by and large, and this is a conversation we've had a lot, we tend to feel like people put way too much focus on balancing in tabletop RPGs. Obviously, you want your combats to be balanced. You don't want first level party up against a Tarrasque.
It won't be very fun for your party if you're just dying around.
But, like, some level of an item being overpowered or something being sort of high-tier loot is just completely acceptable and isn't going to blow things apart quite as much as you think it will. For example, giving a second-level fighter a +1 shield. There's normally an item that's kind of beyond a level 2 fighter. But it doesn't necessarily make your character that much more powerful. It is a good item. It advances your build. But, you know, in terms of it being balanced, it's both completely not a problem in gameplay, and it's something that the system itself would suggest you give the players much later on.
Yeah, a couple levels at least.
You know, but what I've tended to consistently find in tabletop RPGs is that it's the weird, innocuous items that are low level that tend to come around in the weirdest, most powerful, game-breaking ways later on. Which is why I was hesitant to give you guys an alchemy jug in the Epic 6 campaign. Because I have no idea what you guys are going to do with that. It's a, like, uncommon magic item. Most of the stuff it produces is harmless. But somehow, that alchemy jug is going to completely ruin something farther down the line. I just know that it will.
Once we find out a problem that can only be solved by gallons of mayonnaise, we will blow your campaign wide open.
Exactly. Or you'll use gallons of mayonnaise to win a fight you should not have won otherwise. Like, that tends to be the case with loot just across the board. Powerful loot tends not to have quite the impact you thought it would, and low-level loot tends to be what just consistently ruins your plans. But there is kind of a there. A Sword of Sharpness is a very high-level magic item. I don't think it's as powerful as its sort of tag would suggest. It always does max damage when it hits, and there are builds you could do that would ultimately break that. But, you know, in the vast majority of circumstances, giving a player a Sword of Sharpness isn't going to make fights any easier. It's not necessarily going to let that player survive any longer. Where you tend to get into trouble with power levels of loot are spells or spell-like abilities. You don't want to give a first-level party a full necklace of those, like, fireball beads that just cast fireball when you throw one. Because the party will kill themselves with it. Or they'll just use it to solve every one of their problems through the early part of the campaign. it tends to be spells and spell-like effects where you get yourself into trouble.
Mm-hmm. And with those effects, when they're big, powerful things like that, there's kind of twofold reason. One, it's like you don't want to do it because it'll unbalance the game. It'll also whitewash your game to where it's like, problem, I blow it up. Problem, I blow it up. Problem, I blow it up. And now we're high enough level that I can cast that on my own. And now I'm out of beads, who cares? Mm-hmm. And every problem will get solved the same way if it's items along those lines. I think that is a good point of like, overall people care too much. You still want balance in your game, but balance should be there for the sake of the game being fun to play, not the game being fair.
Absolutely. Quite often in tabletop RPGs, fair is the enemy of fun. On both sides of the coin.
Yeah, absolutely. And having a magic item that makes one character seem really powerful over the others can feel like it's not going to be fun or fair because they're just going to kill all the enemies and no one else will get to kill anybody. But in play, that very rarely happens unless it is an item like that necklace of fireballs where it's like a big AoE damaging thing where they just go like, problem, and blow it up.
And those situations tend to be an issue more of the design of combats or encounters or puzzles than the statistics of the items that the characters have. Of course, this guy solves every trap in the dungeon like nothing because he's got that hat that lets him fly. So he just flies past every trap and can figure out how to deactivate them from the other side. So, of course, he's just carrying us through this dungeon. And that is an issue of, like, you probably shouldn't have given them a hat that just lets him fly, and you should design your encounters and your dungeons in a way where that hat of flying doesn't actually give them all that much of an edge.
Yes, you want items to still be good, but design and intentionality. Design your encounters, your stuff around the items that they have or that they're going to have. For instance, if you have a party that has a ton of magic items that lets them fly, ranged enemy. Don't just fill a field with combatants that are all going to be using swords and axes and give your party 3 sets of boots of flying. They're going to pepper them from the sky. Have other flying enemies or ranged enemies in those kinds of situations.
Or smaller hallways where they can't get out of reach of melee combatants. Or enemies like beholders that can shut down magic items.
Especially
and magic
flying
users.
magic items. As somebody who is currently working on a video going over falling damage and how that works.
I thought you were working on a video about your love for beholders.
Oh, no. I mean, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I think all beholders are beautiful.
That's why my short sword was named Beauty.
Exactly. Spectator, technically. But that's beside the point.
But then we went on to fight almost every other type of beholder. Thank you very much.
All besides the Death Tyrant, I think. Anyway, Mind Witness hadn't been printed yet. All of this coming around. I've lost my train of thought because of our rant. But yes, the magic items, the things you have, you need to plan for. Yes. That's the basic gist of it. And the loot you give, you need to build around it. Don't give an item that makes certain problems absolute breezes to solve and then throw 10 of those problems. Throw one of those problems.
Absolutely.
So that player gets to use that item and be like, I have the perfect thing for this and have their time to shine. But don't make every puzzle from that point on ruined by this hat of flying you've given them.
Absolutely.
Make one ruined by it so they feel cool and then make the rest them still having to work around it in other ways.
Or it forces them to use their magic items in clever ways.
Yes.
And that's where part of the fun lies, is that kind of moment of looking at your character sheet and trying to figure out what you have written on there will actually save you. And then every once in a while you find a bunch of things written on there that you had totally forgotten. Like you have armor that lets you breathe underwater and makes you resistant to acid damage. Turns out you have twice as many hit points as you thought you did.
Makes a big difference.
You're not actually drowning. Yeah. A werewolf swallowed by a weretoad.
Runs away into swamp, into sewer, gets tracked by smell. Scumbag werewolves. So, magic items. Tailor them sometimes, other times intentionally not, but don't always give loot that is at least useful.
And it's
even
important.
If it's weird or broad useful, or like weird niche useful, not necessarily like direct to the character's build useful.
And it's important to remember that useless but fun items are just as valuable loot to a lot of players. I mean, the point of playing these games is to have fun.
Yes.
If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Like, at the end of the day, that's just the case. So if you have a thing that is just fun, that tends to just really shine through and tends to get used a lot. And it's really important, you talking about, like, it's important to be intentional and tailor some of your magic items, or intentionally not tailor some. It's also very important to, in vein of that, to know what everybody's playing to some depth. Mm-hmm. For example, in Dungeons & Dragons, the Thief Rogue gets an interesting ability later on where they can use magic items regardless of class, level, or racial requirements. You can find the magical orrery that was built by an elven mage 10,000 years ago and can only be used by a new elven archmage, and there hasn't been one of those in 10,000 years, and the rogue turns it on. The dwarf rogue just flips the switch, and the whole end, the thing that hasn't been activated in 10,000 years and triggers the whole end game of your story is just activated. Mm-hmm. Because they can do that. And it's it's very much it's very much Pippin, twisting the arrow and knocking the corpse into the well. You get that kind of moment, and you'll get a reaction out of the players and get a reaction out of the party. And having that Thief Rogue means you can kind of sprinkle in whatever magic items you want. Like, doesn't matter if you have casters, you can sprinkle in wands. Mm-hmm. You can sprinkle in things sort of intended for fighters or intended for, other sort of more niche characters, knowing that in a pinch you have somebody who can use them.
Yes, and it'll just give you a lot. That class especially gives you lots of options. But this is kind of broad DM advice in general. Know what your players are playing and you don't have to know every niche detail of their class. Mm-hmm. You already have enough to keep track of. But know the kind of build and the kind of things they're going for, because that allows you to give loot that will make them feel like, oh, this is a reward.
And it makes them feel listened to. Mm-hmm. And, and kind of makes them feel noticed. And, like, that's a really big deal for just people in general, is, like, having that moment of, this friend of mine was listening when I talked and was, like, paying attention to what I'm trying to do with this character. Like, that really means a lot, and mm-hmm. players are going to remember that. And it's just a really good way to sort of increase some level of cohesiveness at the table, is by, like, paying attention to what your players are playing, how they're trying to build their character, how they're trying to play their character, and responding to that mm-hmm. with the loot that you give out.
And that can be a fire staff to the pyromancer, but it can also be like, I'm building my character all about subterfuge and like deflection and charlatan mm-hmm. Sort of activities, and you give them a hat of disguise early on. They're like, oh, this is exactly what I need to do what I want to do.
Or speaking of mundane items, they come across the corpse of a nobleman, and now they have all of his clothes, they have all of his papers, ring. They have a signet ring. Yeah. Like, it's mundane loot, and it's valuable loot. But that means a lot to a character who's all about deception, who's all about disguise. And they're going to get good use out of that and take a lot of advantage of it.
Yes, and it'll also... Oftentimes that kind of stuff will open, if you give that mundane but very interesting and weird, it will open whole story arcs because of what you've done. Well, because then that rogue gets in, that charlatan character gets into the ball masquerading as this noble, and his wife is there still in mourning because he never came home. And that interaction happens.
Well, and now it's just new. It's new things the character has to deflect. It's mm-hmm. new things the character has to play around. And honestly, it's probably a good transition into talking about mundane items as loot.
Yes.
Or animal companions as loot. Or at least just like sort of non-magical loot in general. I think we can lump buildings or guild halls and ships mm-hmm. and stuff like that into this as well. And this can really complicate the question of power level and value and
how powerful like is giving your players a boat.
It turns out, how powerful is players stealing a boat from the DM, mm-hmm. Which happened in our very first campaign. We left on a cliffhanger of a boat showing up, and what the DM here didn't realize was that he had given us a boat as loot. We worked very hard to keep that boat intact.
It wasn't a naval battle. It was a board and clear, and very intentionally so.
And It's powerful. It gives us a freedom of movement around the map that we did not have before. It gives us a sort of a freedom of tactic we did not have before. And ultimately, it's something that's become sort of core to our group of characters, but it in no way cracked the campaign open. It in no way broke the story that you were trying to tell.
There wasn't an unwinnable fight against some dangerous evil that would now be easy because you had this item. Right. You could sail to the island of the evil Lich King now because you have the boat. Doesn't mean you can fight him. It's like these sorts of things are not going to bust your campaign wide open, but they can be these very valuable, very interesting things that your players now have. And that's really the
wonderful thing about mundane items is they do complicate the question of sort of power level and value, but very rarely in a way that's going to be game breaking, and very rarely in a way that's going to cause any storytelling strife.
And with all of these items, their origin and their appearance matters, and you can always bring them back around in ways that are potentially detrimental, or at least require clever thinking on the player's part. The boat you guys stole in that campaign was a boat of the great powerful empire. If you don't decorate that thing correctly and you sail to the wrong port and you are not a part of that empire, you are clearly on a stolen ship. Similarly, when we were talking about like that nobleman you find, you have this like foolproof charlatan, like this is my guise I go as now. However, he's missing for a reason. He was presumed dead. You come back. You have to answer those questions now. Mundane loot is really awesome in that way. All loot is, but especially mundane loot is really awesome in that way of like the bigger and like very interesting story sort of twisting items you give in that regard can totally be used to force the characters to backpedal and think creatively to still get the effect out of them, the effectiveness out of them. The same way that you have to be creative oftentimes to use these items. Because there's another thing when talking about mundane. If you just give a signet ring of this kingdom, they might need to come up with their own way to use that, whether it's making their own noble who is presumably from here and avoiding anyone who might know about that noble house. These sorts of things. Like the mundane items breed such creativity there in a way that's really awesome.
And, a lot of people stray away from sort of mundane items because it feels like they don't have any value compared to, like, magic items. But, like, quite often, even, bards will appreciate a particularly fine or ornate instrument compared to the plain one that they started the campaign with. It's an item that doesn't have any, like, magical value. It's not giving them any real statistical bonuses, but the characters find it neat, they find it interesting, and it's something that they want to use compared to what they had before. And and that kind of extends like all the way through. If you're running a pirate heavy campaign, a ship with the same stats as the one the player characters have, but that looks cooler,
hell yeah,
players are going to be all about that kind of thing.
And you can totally give mechanical, hard and fast benefits to mundane items.
Absolutely.
There's countless ones, battering rams and things like that in the system that give these benefits. You don't have to give your fighter a brand new set of heavy plate armor that's magically enchanted. Give them a plate helmet that gives them +2 on intimidation checks because it has the visage of a demon lord on it. That item is mundane. If they cast detect magic, that's just a spooky looking helmet. But if they're wearing it and they scream at somebody, they're going to be that much scarier. And then it almost feels like they've gotten a magic item at that point, but it's a mundane thing. It's just giving them that little sort of boost in some specific regard. That's logic based, not a wizard did it, so it magically lets this happen.
And it's the same thing, especially if you're talking about hideouts or player bases, which we've talked about in the past. They can get bonuses to certain checks because of certain things in their base. Because they have a library, they can get a bonus to investigation checks trying to find out information on these monsters they're hunting. Because they have these certain workshops or these certain apprentices or craftsmen, they can get bonuses when using their downtime activities to try and craft items or to try and build something. They can get raw statistical bonuses from a non-magical source.
Absolutely. And should, oftentimes,
Absolutely.
With the more interesting mundane items. But never underestimate the value of a cool-looking thing. especially if it is slanted to the character, where it's like, this character is a bard and plays this kind of instrument. It doesn't have to be an instrument of the bards. It can just be, this is a finely crafted of this exquisite material and this exquisite material. Like, you will not find a prettier mandolin than this one. And the bard is like, this is the most beautiful instrument of my time. I am so excited to now have and carry this. And maybe you can make it be that if it gives them a +1 on their performance check or whatever, but it doesn't even need that oftentimes if it's really cool and unique and meaningful in other ways.
Killing the powerful Fey spirit that has been, the source of this whole arc that the players are on, and getting non-magical but really cool, panpipes made out of bone. The bard's going to be all about that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be... it doesn't have to confer any effect in order for the bard to readily swap that out for the gear that they already have. Or just to carry it if they weren't carrying that item already.
Mm-hmm. And before we jump to when to give the best loot, there's one other item, loot talk, I want to have that I think is like painfully oftentimes and like criminally underused, and that is consumables. And specifically interesting consumables. Every dragon horde you go to has 7 or 8 potions of healing in it, and then a bunch of magical swords and armor and bows and staffs. Why not have spell scrolls? Unique niche potions, potions of heroism, potions of giant strength, things that are going to give temporarily very big bonuses or very niche game-changing bonuses to characters, and scattering those more often throughout your map, throughout your world, throughout your loot piles. I think oftentimes the most criminally underused of these is spell scrolls, and that is because of the rules of spell scrolls.
Right.
If you're interested, shameless plug here, watch Help Action. I go into a lot of niche detail about 5e rules. There's one entirely on spell scrolls and how best to use them, and optional rules in how to make spell scrolls something that is accessible to anybody to use. Because I think this will revolutionize the way you play the game, so long as your party and your players are good about not abusing the system. You can just all of a sudden throw out a couple like Shield of Faith spell scrolls, and your fighter's like +2 AC for a fight. Sign me up. When we're going into the big fight, I'm going to buff myself with one of those. And then it has these like, oh, when do I use this? Is now the right time kind of thing, because it's not, it avoids that, oh, I've busted my campaign wide open because I gave the fighter +2 plate armor. It's like, no, he's got a +2 AC from the Shield of Faith in cast, but that's only before one fight. And if they don't use it on the biggest one, then you haven't busted your campaign wide open with it. So I think consumables are huge and should be used more often.
And there's no need to limit yourself to the consumables listed in whatever rule book you use. I'm a big fan of stuff like special oils carried by monster hunters that you apply to your blade that gives 1 minute of an extra D4 or a D6 of fire damage or frost damage, and a character having 1 or 2 vials of each, because they're going to try and use them when it's going to seem the most beneficial, or they're going to use them against enemies that they'll have the greatest effect. They're not going to just go into every fight buffing their weapon with with fire damage.
It's not a flame tongue sword.
Right.
It's an oil of the flame tongue.
And you don't have to give out a flame tongue weapon in order to let the players have those cool moments. And it's another one of those things, as you mentioned earlier, that you can seed early on in a quest or early on in the campaign with sort of the intention of them being used in specific encounters later. And that's a consumable that doesn't really have like an equivalent in D&D, but it makes combats more interesting. It gives the players another sort of tactic and another item in their toolbox. But they're consumables. They have one use of it. They have 2 uses of it. And it's a little bit more interesting to find in a loot pile than just various sizes of potions of healing.
Yes. And the beauty of consumables in loot instead of consumables that are purchased is that consumables that are loot can be much more finite. If you have a shop that sells plus 1d6 fire damage oils for weapons at 50 gold a pop, then you're going to have a good group shouldn't do this, but a lot of players are going to be like, I buy the
a
entire stock,
Yep.
and then I figure out how to make it myself, and then I just have a plus 1d6 on every weapon I ever use for the rest of the campaign. And that's
sure,
kind of,
by the time you're far enough along into a campaign, that can be fine.
Yeah.
You're not going to get yourself into a weird balance issue with that. But they can be finite, and they can be tailored by the game master. They can be things that the players wouldn't think of buying or wouldn't know was an option. They can be a little more niche. They can be a little bit more varied. And there can be a lot of them, or there can be a few of them. And you get a direct hand in that.
Yes. And it also, especially with magical effect ones, spell scrolls in particular, can give the party access to a spell that nobody else would have access to normally if you follow certain optional rules, where all of a sudden it's, if there's a magical vault they need to get into that you have to dispel a ward on, they might need a dispel magic scroll, and the whole part of the quest line of getting into this vault might be finding this dispel magic scroll or getting someone to make it for them so that they can do that. And that can be a big, like, there could be this mythical, like, we have to cast this, like, we have to cast Disintegrate on this wall to get it open. There's not a whole lot of wizards who can cast Disintegrate, but there is rumor of a spell scroll of Disintegrate that's tucked away in X cavern, X place. That's a whole adventure arc you send them on.
Tracking down a wizard that can cast Disintegrate.
And convincing them.
And what they have the players do in return for the spell scroll sets up whole story arcs in itself. And as we kind of mentioned earlier, you can do whole arcs that are about tracking down specific pieces of loot. Or you can have whole quest lines to get specific pieces of loot for other quest lines.
Yes.
And that makes it feel a little better as a DM to hand Excalibur to your party because they had to go through a whole quest to get it, and they need it specifically for this whole other quest that they're doing. It helps feel like giving out powerful loot is both worth it and a little more balanced, because it sort of removes the illusion that the players just have it for no reason and now they're going to break the campaign.
Super busted and super powerful. This is a good segue to, when do we give loot? When do you give good loot? When's the best time to give the powerful item that's so perfectly intrinsic to the build the player's using? When do you give that item?
You already mentioned earlier that it should really make sense where loot is. And I think by and large that is going to be the limiting factor as to when you give out that loot. Giving out a cloak tailor-made for your rogue shouldn't just be on an enemy in the first encounter of the session. It should be on a special enemy or being used as part of another side quest that the players can get involved in, or something the player characters have to track down or is gifted to them by someone. And it should make sense that it sort of shows up where and when it does. Especially if it's a powerful magic item, maybe it's already making waves. Maybe the player characters are tracking down this legendary thief that they keep hearing about in town, and trying to figure out how he's getting away with all the stuff he's doing, and then defeating him gives the rogue in the party, his magic item and lets them do some of the same things. As far as balancing when to give magic items, I tend to throw a lot of that out the window. I think most magic items, especially interesting ones, should be given at the latest 3/4 of the way through the campaign. You want your player characters to actually use the things you've given them. Nobody likes to get the most powerful weapon in the game just right before the final boss fight. Yeah. It's a lot more fun, a lot more interesting to get that stuff earlier on, especially if it's tailored to a character or tailored to a build, because then it ends up feeling much more personal by the end. It feels like their item, not... they sort of forget that this was a sword of an ancient barbarian king. This is my sword.
I am that barbarian king now.
Right.
And I think by extension of this, items that either, like for powerful magical items intrinsic to the character and their build, having items that are gained early on and either scale with level to some regard or scale with story that happens, or scale with specific class features, is a really good way to have an item that the player can use from early on till late, while not making encounters early on harder to balance because it's a wash every time they swing, they kill something. If you have a sword that does, You know, every time that you, for instance, a rogue, every time the rogue sneak attacks, they get to do something with sneak attack dice, but it's intrinsic to the number of dice that they have. Like they can re-roll any number of their sneak attack dice. That will scale as they get more sneak attack dice. It won't. Early on, it'll be like, oh, I rolled a 2. Let me re-roll. Oh, it's a 4. That's 2 extra damage. Hooray. But later on, I roll 7d6 for my sneak attack. Ooh, these 3 are 1s and this one's a 2. I re-roll all those. Now this 5 damage turned into 12 or 13 or 14 damage. And that can scale with that ability really well so that it's always a useful item for that character. Another cool thing that I've seen, I mean, if anyone's gone through the like Tal'Dorei stuff from Critical Role, Matthew Mercer has these like the Vestiges of Divergence, which are these like big, powerful magical items that are like linked to certain gods of the world. And they have like early, middle, and late forms that are based on how much you kind of lean into being a champion of that god. And so early on when you get it, it's a cool buff, but it's not game breaking.
Right.
But then when you're like, I'm going to swear fealty to this god, to the Raven Queen to do her thing, like the armor unlocks and does extra things. And having items like that as you progress the story of the item, you get more usefulness out of the item, is a really cool way to give a powerful item that continues to be powerful.
And it's, you know, it would take some homework and take some work to sit down and do. But you can make a whole range of magic items that, you know, maybe over the course of the game, the players are getting these special soul crystals, and they can spend those soul crystals to sort of upgrade certain unique pieces of gear. You know, for a couple of those soul crystals, they can get a +1 to their weapon, or a +1 to this unique legendary armor, or, you know, gain another minor buff, or buy off a minor detriment of some kind. Like, you would have to kind of sit down and do some balance work to get it to kind of work out well, and you'd want to be very sparing in giving those out as loot. But that's another piece of loot that instead of just giving them another magic sword, you've given them something of extreme value that they can use to upgrade their magic sword. And that type of stuff, as well as like sort of making characters feel like craftsmen and feeling like their equipment is tailored to them, helps you give out powerful and interesting loot early and letting it sort of scale and build over the course of the campaign. And the other really easy way to get around this problem is to give out niche powerful loot. Equipment or items that are very powerful in very select circumstances, and therefore it will continue to pop up over the course of the campaign, but isn't going to blow any single encounter wide open. Give the players a sword essentially at level 1 that blocks all mind effects, or like single target spell effects, but not like throwing a fireball at someone. Like somebody used power word kill, or a sort of specific curse like that. The sword just blocks the effect, but the players take a certain amount of damage every time they do that, and that damage scales based off of the level of the spell that it's blocking. That sword is not going to save them from the enemy wizard casting fireball, all of the enemy archers, that guy with a sword, this monster with fire breath or poison teeth.
And early on, it's not going to, like, the difference between, like, you have a mind-altering effect that's first or second level, or you take some fire, some damage based on this effect blocking it, early on is going to kind of be a wash a lot of the times, and like, well, at least I'm not getting mind controlled, or my mind, I'm going to still act on my turn, but that just took a third of my health away to avoid me getting my mind messed with. So
it's essentially the same thing as that enemy caster using their turn to make an attack rather than attempt a mind-altering spell. But it's also one of those things that's just easy to stat your combats around, and interesting when it continues to pop up over the course of the rest of the campaign, especially as, you know, it gives the players some information that somebody just tried to use a mind-altering effect on me. Like, I just took a bunch of fire damage from my sword. Or, you know, it gives them some reference as to how powerful of an ability was just burned against them. It's powerful. You could protect even a level 1 character from power word kill. They'd take probably enough fire damage to kill them. It's a powerful item, but it's not broken because it's sort of niche.
So you can give very powerful loot early on, and you can make it scale, you can make it niche, you can just make... There's ways, if you're thoughtful... Again, intentionality is key when you're running these games. If you're intentional with how you build and set it up, it can scale well, or it can be more powerful the later on you are, or the type of things you're facing later on. Another thing I can think of is if there's a kind of niche sort of thing where, like, this ability only really works in this circumstance, and early on this circumstance is pretty irrelevant or only occasionally relevant,
Right.
but late game, like a sword that deals extra damage to undead. It's like, you might fight a zombie here or there, but if you know there's going to be this big lich arc later on, it's like, that sword's going to be perfect then, but that's going to be 5-10 levels from now. It'll still have some uses up till then, but when it comes up, it'll be really big later on. Or like a weapon that works really well underwater. And you know there's this big Kuatoa invasion arc coming up in your campaign. This is going to be the perfect trident for your fighter to use when, like, normally he's sword and board. Now he's trident and board because they're going underwater, and this thing works really well underwater.
In that case, I'd probably swap out the board for a net myself, but...
Yeah, but you can use that on... If you're going for the, like... Is that Myrmidon Gladiator? Is it Myrmidons that are net and trident? The cheesiest way to be a gladiator, by the way. You just, like, throw a net on somebody, they get tangled up, and you just stab them while they're tangled up. It
doesn't require anywhere near the amount of skill of a Dimacarius, who's, like
like
a naturally ambidextrous person, so they have two short swords, so they can block or fight with either one. And just the amount of coordination that requires...
Dual wielding is not smart unless you're very good. And even then, sword and shield's probably better. But that's beside the point.
Right. But historically, there is at least one example of people who did dual wield, and that's the Demarcarius gladiators. But that's a totally different conversation.
If you want our bonus action breaking down the cheesiness of gladiator fighting styles, please give that in the comments.
You know, like talking about like giving out powerful loot early on is another valuable place to kind of mention stuff like animal companions or adopting a baby owl bear or something like that. Like, you know, the characters have a baby griffin that they're raising, or a dragon wormling or something. You can give out even unique monsters as loot, knowing full well that when this thing's an adult, the player characters are going to use it to just shred what's left of this campaign, but it has to grow up. It's on that clock. And sure, like, even when it's young, it might be dangerous, especially to commoners or to sort of, common bandits or like early game threats. But it is going to sort of scale with the players over time.
A baby owlbear is not very scary. An adult owlbear is, but not so much when you're a 15th level party.
Right. And it's something that, like, the player characters, in many circumstances, aren't even going to want to risk all that much.
Especially if they've raised it from level 2 to 15, and this isn't a full-grown owlbear. This is Quincy, my baby, that I've raised since he was just a little owlbearling. And
don't let Fluffykins, the terror of the skies, into this combat.
Otherwise, he might get scraped.
He's just a little tiny dragon.
He's just a baby.
He's just a little dragon. We must protect him.
Yes.
And then it's another one of those things that, like, you can just sort of vaguely make motions to threaten and really get the players to jump, to jump into a certain fight or jump against a certain NPC because those poachers kidnapped our boy. And we're getting him back. And we're killing every one of them. And we're letting every other poacher in the world know that if they try it, we're coming for them.
And another really cool thing you can do as far as when you're giving loot and tailored good loot for a player is, especially in more sandboxy style games, give the rumor of a big powerful magical sword for your swordsman character. And that can be a background optional quest that's always going on. They've heard this rumor, they can't find anything more about it, and then as they get second, third level, they hear something that leads them to another clue.
Or they're, or as they're traveling around the world, they're checking more and more archives. They're talking to more and more NPCs who are rumored to know something. And that gives you a little bit of control as to when that item kind of pops out into the world and when they sort of truly get access to it. Or give them powerful magic items that need to be fixed in some way. You don't get
curse broken on them.
Don't get on the roll Flame of the West
until you get the shards of Narsil and recraft.
Exactly. You can have those items that because in the book, Aragorn is just carrying Narsil around. He just has the sword with like the foot or foot and a half of hilt on it, and then in the books it's reforged into Andoril as soon as they reach Rivendell, but it gives the players something that they have, something that they're seeking to understand, and something that they need special materials in order to repair or in order to recharge. And then it's just another sort of really satisfying acquisition when they are finally able to pull all the pieces together, track down all the remaining shards, or track down the unique item or the unique person that they need to fix it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that whenever magic items or like specific pieces of loot are quest lines, you've done something right. Like
Yes.
when seeking them out or seeking out the things to reforge or to fix or to decurse, when you have quest lines based around getting a cool thing, that is awesome. And that makes for, it's like the party comes together because they've heard this legend and they want their friend, the swordsman, to get the best sword that they've ever heard of. And they go through all this work to get it. And that reward, that sword is carried with pride from that point on by all the party.
And let the characters determine some of that. You know, if a player seems interested in tracking down sort of a certain magic item, or, you know, just asking about rumors of a certain type of item, build some of that into your world. Begin to introduce those quest lines so then the players can have the satisfaction of acquiring the thing that they were looking for. Everybody loves to walk into the magic shop that's full of every magic item in the DMG, and they just took out a dragon, so they've got the money to just load up on cool magical gear. And that can be a lot of fun, and it's fun to have locations like that. But it's a lot more fun for those magic shops to be full of oddities, to be full of weird things and niche things, because that's where the players are going to end up spending their money, and not necessarily full of 10 copies of Excalibur and, you know, 2 copies of, 2 different versions of the Holy Grail. It's just not going to be as satisfying to get that level of loot that way.
Give the weird consumable magic item at the shop that they can buy and be like, this will never come in handy, but why not? And then they're like, oh, this will be perfect for this moment. 5 sessions later, and make Excalibur a quest. That at the end of it, you're getting that Excalibur.
And it's a lot of fun early on to give out magic items, especially powerful ones, that come with some risk to using them. Whether, like, you know, even touching this will bind it to a user, and you have to, you know, succeed a pretty hard series of con saves in order for that to happen, or there's some cost to using them. It's the balancing is just sort of half the time not a thing when it comes to magic items, and you shouldn't shy away from powerful magic items being in the game early on, because that's how you introduce stories, that's how you introduce quests, and that's how you help make the player characters, in many cases, feel like they're not just other NPCs.
And powerful cursed items are a very easy way to help kind of balance stuff. And that's a whole other can of worms that could be opened here. Shameless self-plug once again. Watch your video going over how to make better cursed items, because there's a lot of good information there you can extract.
It's much more interesting if players want to use cursed items.
Exactly.
And if the curse isn't just,
I touched it, I'm evil now, I'm going to kill whoever I near me.
Oh, I got stabbed for 10 points of damage, time to murder my best friend.
Yeah.
It's much more interesting if curses have a benefit and have a downside, and it's left up to the players to decide whether or not that's worth it. I just find that much more interesting, and you'll get a lot of, you know, the player characters accidentally wiping out a caravan of guards that was headed toward the evil tyrant's fortress in the mountains, and getting the sword that was specially forged for him, you know, by all these kidnapped dwarves way down south that he's intended to use, is also something the players have that's probably pretty powerful that they probably shouldn't use. And that, you know, drives them straight into the center of the main story, because they all of a sudden have all this information about the world. All of a sudden the enemy's eye is upon them, trying to figure out what happened to his sword, damn it.
Yes.
And that, you know, it kind of to some degrees returns the revenge arc around the other way, where now it's the main villain seeking revenge for something the players did. And it lets you create an interesting and powerful magic item that might have some downsides to use, and throw it into the game early on, and in an interesting way that feels like it is part of the world and part of what's going on.
Yeah. I think that's pretty decent place to stop here. Magic items, loot, mundane, interesting things. Loot is a broad spectrum of stuff. give it out often, make it awesome, and be intentional with when, where, what, and how these items are procured.
And don't worry so much about power levels or sort of raw balancing, because there's plenty of ways around it, and there are plenty of times where it just doesn't matter all that much.
And if you're making interesting items, not just this is sword, but much bigger sword and much better sword, you're going to probably avoid a lot of those every fight gets done the same way sort of issues with magic items or with magical loot. I think that's a good place for us to call it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening. Hope you found this interesting, useful, or at least entertaining. What's the best loot you ever got? It can be a loot, or it could be any sort of loot. What to you is like the pinnacle of loot? If anyone would like to put in the comment, like what is the items or things that have stuck with you the most as a player, or more as the person, like the player playing characters from past characters? What's that thing that was like, oh yeah, this quest line made it so worth it to get this thing, or this weird niche ability came in so clutch in this moment?
I have something in mind for the best piece of loot I feel like I ever gave out. I don't necessarily. I feel like there's a couple things from like early campaigns that stick out. Holt, my first D&D character, getting the like Boots of Elvenkind, which just gave him advantage on stealth rolls as long as they're like moving. Which we got as well in such a dumb way that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's like it's a magic item I used literally the rest of the campaign. And really enjoyed having. I think the best piece of loot I feel like I ever gave out was maybe the Blood of Queen Morgan, the ghost ship that you guys got in the Treasure Planet campaign.
Yeah.
Just because it's a really, really cool ship, both just like aesthetically and stats wise.
What immediately comes to my mind is the blade that was thrust into my hand as Hadrian in your campaign. Just because of the nature of how we got it was very cool. And it was a powerhouse melee weapon for a support caster.
Absolutely.
And so I didn't use it that often. It was particularly good against certain enemies that were more late game enemies. There's lots of these kind of tenets and rules put into play with the power level of this. It was a very powerful item. I didn't use all that often, but was absolutely a like pinnacle set piece of my character. This blade on his hip was like, this is exactly who this character is this blade. And when I used it, it was very effective and felt very cool.
Well, and it's I love the scene in the original Conan the Barbarian, where it sort of, where Conan finds a sword of the Atlantean. He's knocking like all of the like corrosion off the outside of the blade, and like the ringing of the steel makes the skeleton who was holding the sword the whole time kind of slump down, like, well, job done. It's yours now. And I love that. It's like sort of imagery so much of the like long dead king who's still sitting there in silent vigil, sort of passing on that weapon to someone else.
Your
And
turn.
I love just implying to characters that it feels faintly like, like when you go to grab it, that it's pushed into your hand. And quite often you get cool moments too where player characters will like talk to this random skeleton and be like here's why we're here, here's what we're doing, like, I'm taking your sword, I hope you don't mind. Or you get the sort of barbarian version of that response and stuff, like, and it's like, this is a non-magical skeleton, but like characters still sort of feel this need to be like it's like
your blade is going to good use.
Like,
I am the magic cop of my generation.
I bow to no god. I bow to no man. Like, I am so and so of the north, and it's like, okay,
you're hardcore enough. Have my battle axe.
Like, it's like, and just like, implying that like when they go to grab it, that it's like kind of pushed into their hand, like makes the characters, feel like they're meant to wield this, and it ends up. It just ends up feeling really cool. It ends up being a kind of memorable moment, and I'm glad that's
definitely that's what immediately. I'm sure there's other things out there. The alchemy jug with fiddlesticks. My lizard folk sorcerer who used it almost exclusively to eat mayonnaise and unsettling him out the rest of the campaign is another one that's up there. But as far as like coolness and stuff, that's definitely the one that immediately comes to mind. But what's the one that immediately comes to mind for you? If you want to comment of like, what's your item or your story about an item or a piece of loot that just felt the coolest or is the most memorable to you, please throw that in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this, there's a ton of these kind of long form conversations where we talk about all sorts of RPG and storytelling stuff and give our opinions and advice on it. There's also lots of live play on our channel, or like RPG play of multiple different systems. If you're a 5e player, Help Action dives deep and gives good advice on rules and optional rules to apply to systems in the game to make them run smoother. So please feel free to check any of that out.
All the rules that you covered so far are way too complicated.
And it's one of those things where before I started making the videos, I was like, oh yeah, I know how fall damage works. I was like, oh, I don't know exactly how fall damage works at all. Or all these other things. So please check that stuff out. And thank you for watching and listening to this. What is the best loot? Well, clearly whichever loot is in the hands of Tarquin, the androgynous body. Loot is a loot.
Yes, you can make a loot.
A loot can be loot.
Are you recording this?
I am.
Okay, yes. A loot can be loot.
Every loot could be loot.
Mm-hmm.
But not all loot
is a loot.
Is a loot.
Yes. Some loot is a flute.
What are you talking about?
Some loot is a pair of boots.
When to give out the best loot? Only when it rhymes with the word loot. Now I want to make a dungeon by a crate, like the your Vault of the Mad Mage sort of deal. But he has his loot room, and it's like, oh, that's where all the loot is. And you go in there, and it's just like his designer guitar collection strung up on the wall. It's like, this one was played by Filch Nimblefingers.
Please do that in the campaign where I play Tarquin, because like that is absolutely the room to walk into. Just like, oh, he just like
that's amazing.
He just goes through the rest of the dungeon with an armful of loots.
I want that the room that's like marked loot, and you go in there, and it's just full of like, and it has like little stands on it of like this was played by Filch Nimblefingers in, I don't know, in. What's a Woodstock? What's fantasy Woodstock called?
Woodstock, I think.
Woodstock, probably. Played by Filch Nimblefingers in
I think
the year
it's
243.
And I think the joke of the dungeon should be that everything is misspelled.
And so the one room...
into something... Yes. Everything is misspelled into something else, so you never quite know, like...
And that room is the one that's spelled correctly, because it's actually the loot room.
Yeah. Or it's spelled L-O-O-T.
But
it's full of loots. So I think there are plenty of words you could get away with doing that with. And it would be very funny to, like, especially that you have a map, to try and be like, okay, we figured out the first 2 rooms in this place were misspelled. We're about to enter the 3rd room. Can we decipher
what this means? We just got to get to the room that's got the loot in it. That's the only thing we got to know for sure. And you get there, and it's just a bunch of designer guitars.
Well, it's even better if it's just a side room halfway through the dungeon.
Yeah.
Because then my bard will carry an armful of loots through the rest of the dungeon.
If you don't have... this is another good conversation about loot. If your party doesn't have a bag of holding or, like, a cart, what happens when you just give them, like... Not magic items,
pieces, yeah.
But yeah, you give them that like massive amount of things that they see value in, but they couldn't possibly carry all of.
They quite often they come back. We have done that before. Where it's like we return to town and just like rent a couple wagons to haul our gold hoard around, or it really forces them to start making some choices, which is kind of fun by itself.
Filch Nimblefingers was a legend, but they've got 3... Can't think of... I'm weak on the pun game today. What's a good, like...
Most of the... This loot is actually magic, which means it's the one I'm actually going to take.
But it's not... What if the one magic one is... Well, then I just take the magic one and a couple of the non. Like, what if the ugliest one is the magic one? A real Indiana Jones cup situation.
Right.
Oh, yeah, he's a cup.
And honestly, that is a totally different conversation about loot. But the Indiana Jones like cup gag thing is such an excellent vessel for just marvelous moments in a D&D campaign.
It's a good way for like puzzles, like a good thing to like kind of prime your brain for how to think in making puzzles.
Well, and they don't have to be it doesn't have to be an insta kill. It can have other nasty effects, and the players will just absolutely subject themselves to it
because there's a chance of greatness. Yes,
like that is absolutely a fun. That's a very fun setup for a for an either D&D puzzle or for or to try and trick players into getting the cursed magic items instead of the actual valuable ones.